In honor of spooky season, I decided to create a rather disturbing video for you all. Normally when people think about horror in the Halo universe, their mind goes to the Flood, and it makes a lot of sense because the Flood's pretty creepy. But today I wanted to go over something that is different but also terrifying: the ferocity and uncaring nature of the brutes. Imagine a world untouched by humankind. A virgin planet with lush forests, clean oceans, and untapped ecological beauty. The ideal location for a refreshing nature detox, where it's possible to camp in solitude, hike trails that are almost entirely untraveled by people, or perhaps get away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. This was exactly what the planet Beta Gabriel offered to its visitors. Though it was in the same star system as humanity's military stronghold of Reach, its meager population, and due to the fact that it was to be preserved precisely for the reasons I already outlined, meant that it was a wonderful vacation destination. To many, this planet was an attractive place to visit, and the perfect way to spend a relaxing weekend eating comfort foods by a fire. Perhaps even a way to connect with the roots of humanity, minus the fear of starvation, or being hunted by deadly wildlife, of course. That's what Beta Gabriel was. At least. Until the brutes showed up. When the carnivorous Covenant client species arrived via their alien spacecraft, all of the blessings of solitude and isolation quickly transformed into curses. With nowhere to run and no militaristic force to protect them, the people unfortunate enough to be on the planet when the creatures made landfall would be hunted, tortured in horrific ways, and eventually eaten. The hundreds of innocent lives were nothing but cattle to the ape-like animals. Before long, the brutes were the dominant species on the planet, and as a result, they decided to stick around. This was the perfect situation for an Oni agent, a man by the name of Brien, to observe how the beasts operated. You see, Connor had a morbid fascination for the Jiralhanae, or brutes, and this camp of theirs, as horrific as it might have been, presented a unique opportunity to study their behavior. This interest of his didn't exist for no reason, however. In fact, it was spawned from a terrifying personal experience. He and a group of other human soldiers were on a voyage through Covenant-controlled space when they were boarded by a pack of the animalistic adversaries. Whether through sheer luck or a surprising amount of skill, he and his compatriots managed to tranquilize all 6 of their boarders, and once they were unconscious, each of the creatures was bound. Brutes are extremely tough animals, though, and it didn't take long for the sedatives to wear off. When they did, the restraints that had been used to neutralize them were simply torn apart. Connor managed to hide as the monsters quickly overwhelmed his fellow Marines. In the skirmish, they were lucky enough to kill the leader of their pack, but the beast's death only served to enrage his underlings even more. 4 of the remaining 5 brutes laid the humans to waste, and once they fell, their attention was quickly turned to one of their own number. This Jiralhanae, for whatever reason, had decided not to join them in their crazed attack, and as a result, was ferociously mauled by his compatriots in a display of truly ghastly and unmitigated violence. Connor slipped away, likely using the moments of infighting to buy himself the time he needed to make it into an evac craft. Ever since the altercation, he found himself haunted, no doubt stricken by PTSD and the grief of watching what was likely his friends die horrifically. This nightmarish sequence of events drove him to seek out more information about the monsters. He gathered every piece of footage he could find and analyzed it to the best of his abilities. As an accomplished linguist who deciphered the language of a lost tribe discovered in the North American tundra of Earth, and even more impressively, translated the signing of Covenant engineers, he was uniquely capable of discerning any meaning the brutes might convey in the videos he watched. On many different occasions, he requested to go on another voyage into Covenant space in an attempt to find the Jiralhanae homeworld and study them further. These requests were always denied, but as time went on and engagements with the bear-like behemoths continued, an apparent animosity for the other species in the Covenant was observed. If they were understood better, it was possible that this inherent volatility could be used to fracture the Covenant and give humanity a much-needed edge. So, when Beta Gabriel was taken over by the brutes, Connor was finally granted the okay on his request to record their behaviors. His objective was quite clear: document their actions to see if they could be exploited against the Covenant and discern how many survivors, if any, remained. Once he arrived, he climbed up into a tree about a mile from their camp so that he had a decent vantage point to conduct his reconnaissance. He watched from afar as many prisoners were tortured and forced to compete against each other in games with indiscernible rules. For 4 days, he watched as the surviving humans were mistreated beyond measure. Then, things got even worse. Somehow, they had caught wind of his presence, and before he could escape, one of the brute warriors was already making his way up the tree Connor had been staked out in. In a panicked motion, he reached for a tranquilizer gun, but as he did, he lost grip of the foliage and plummeted down. His body landed with a heavy thud, and he was immediately knocked unconscious. Sometime later, he was awoken by the unpleasant sound and smell of a brute bellowing in his face. Bits of spittle and hatred splattered onto his features, the smell so intense that he couldn't help but to vomit. He kept his gaze down and away from his captors, as he had learned that direct eye contact could be seen as a challenge. Needless to say, if any of the creatures felt as though he was being defiant, a measly 5'5" or 2.5 meter human stood no chance when pit against a 9 foot or 3 meter tall monster in a fist fight. The only weapon he had to work with was his tranquilizer gun, which thankfully he was able to holster before falling from the tree earlier. He really wished he had his trusty Magnum right about now, but even if he did, he doubted it would do him much good. There were a lot of brutes around him, and single-handedly killing them all was more than a little bit of an unreasonable feat. As he wiped the brute's saliva and puke from his face, he surveyed his surroundings. The Jiralhanai camp was centered around their spaceship. Surrounding it were human-built buildings that had been ransacked, and worse yet, thousands of human bones littered the area, some still possessing bits of flesh and sinew. He wasn't the only survivor, but everyone else around him appeared to be extremely emaciated, frail, and in no condition to fight or even make a break for it. Surprisingly, that was an option. They weren't imprisoned by cells or walls of any kind, but everyone knew if they ran and somehow managed to slip away, they'd simply be playing the brute's game. Their mortal peril would become the creature's leisure activity, the world's worst match of manhunt, where the man is literally hunted and the loser becomes breakfast, lunch, or dinner. The more he examined the area, the more grisly details he took note of. The other captives were battered beyond belief. Their clothes were stained with hues of browns and reds, mixtures of their own shit and blood. They each had wounds that were obviously left unattended, each festering as a result. Piles of feces were mixed in with the human bones, and occasionally strewn about were methane tanks and breathers, evidence that the brutes had taken to eating their own forces. The poor Ungoi or grunts, unfortunate enough to be assigned to this ungodly position. Unbeknownst to him, a bitter rivalry was brewing within the brutes that surrounded them. One of their number, a warrior named Ceratus, was disgusted by their actions. Not because he had any respect or admiration for the humans, but because he found living amongst them appalling. His chieftain was a particularly dull Jiralhanai named Parabum. Ceratus had a deep-seated hatred for his commander for several reasons. For one, he was extremely dumb. For two, he was a crappy leader that allowed many of his subordinates to do as they pleased, rather than leading them through fear. For three, his bloodline had an ancient feud with Ceratus's. In Jiralhanai culture, there are two primary skeins, or forms of belief. The Vyloth value intelligence and the use of technology, while the Ratol prefer to cling to the ways of old. Essentially Luddites that rule strictly through physical prowess. Ceratus and his brother Malidus were of Vyloth descent, and Parabum fancied himself Ratol. The unifying force of the Covenant and their religion, the Great Journey, helped drown out the hatred between the two belief systems for a time. But in situations like this, their disdain for one another quickly rose to the surface like a hungry shark smelling blood in the water. On top of all of this, Ceratus' brother Malidus had been killed by Parabum when they first arrived on the human-occupied world. Much like Ceratus, Malidus felt Parabum was unfit to be their leader, and so he challenged him to a duel. Unfortunately, Parabum was far stronger and made quick work of his unruly packmate. Though he had defeated him fairly, according to their customs, that fact did little to diminish the flames of hatred burning within Ceratus. He wanted to leave this planet, and he wanted to see Parabum's head roll. He also wanted to eat the humans in their midst and be done with it, but Parabum insisted on lengthy hunting procedures and meal preparations before doing so. Ceratus bickered back and forth with his compatriots about what they should be doing, speaking somewhat freely thanks to the fact that Parabum was currently away on a hunt. It's implied that their fearless leader fled from a battle at some point, perhaps even the confrontation on Reach, and the fear of the Sanshayum or Prophet's wrath was his primary motivation for staying on the planet. It's unclear what exactly happened prior to the events outlined in the story, but whatever it was, it only served to fuel the anger Ceratus already felt for Parabum. Connor watched as the beasts grunted and growled to one another. He'd only been here for a few hours, and he'd already started to piece together a modicum of meaning behind their communications. He could tell they were getting angry and impatient, but he still wasn't sure why they were being kept alive. He needed to discern what was going on a bit better. So he discreetly struck up a conversation with one of the only people that seemed mentally capable enough to reciprocate. He recognized the man instantly. He was Dask Gavadim, the spiritual leader of a religious belief system simply referred to as the Triad. The man had disappeared quite some time ago, an event his followers determined was some kind of transcendence. The triad religion grew in number exponentially as a result, but clearly there was no divine ascent to speak of, as the man sat before him was obviously flesh and blood. Dask explained their situation a bit more, informing him that the brute's leader was currently not present, and as a result, they were ever so slightly less likely to be consumed. In a quick motion, several of the beasts turned their attention back towards the Whispering Men. Each of them attempted to avert their eyes, but one of the monsters grabbed Dask anyways. As he did so, another one of the survivors, a man named Haig that Connor recognized as a famous game hunter, stumbled backwards and accidentally made eye contact with one of the behemoths. That was it. The brute tossed Dask aside and reached for Haig, lifting him into the air. One of them grabbed his left arm, another his right, while more wrapped their claws around his legs. Connor closed his eyes and tried to imagine anything but what was about to happen, willing his mind to go blank. A few quiet moments passed before the horrific sounds of wet crunches and the screams of a man being ripped apart filled the air. When Connor opened his eyes again, a new brute had made his way into their midst. The hulking creature, obviously their leader, silently stood over the bloodied remains of what used to be Haig. In the ensuing carnage, Ceratus had slipped away just beyond a tree line and watched from afar. Parabum was accompanied by 2 bodyguards, and his immense hammer was resting atop his shoulder, so there was no way he could take him one-on-one. The brute leader was angry that one of the humans had been killed without his permission, and so he addressed the pack, trying to determine who was responsible for the death. When no one spoke up, Ceratus finally strode forth and took responsibility for his actions. As much as he loathed his fellow Geralhani, there was no way for him to defeat him in combat, and so he was forced to play along, to feign obedience. Parabum approached him and dug his claws into his neck, his sharp nails sinking into his flesh. Ceratus remained silent, and eventually Parabum released his grip, directing his attention to the newly acquired human in their number. One of the bigger brutes in their pack was responsible for acquiring the fresh meat, a fact he stated proudly as soon as Parabum took notice of the man. Instead of congratulating him, the chieftain approached the much larger warrior and attempted to intimidate him, much like he had just done to Ceratus. It appeared to work, at least for the time being. Connor and the surviving humans watched as the beasts began serving and devouring their newly acquired meals of human flesh. The sights and smells were almost too much to handle, but regardless of the horror before him, he could sense a growing conflict between the 2 members of the pack. One of the brutes stood over a fire farther away from their leader, a clean-shaven creature that was speaking to and holding the attention of several of his packmates. He had no idea what they were saying, but he did notice that the chieftain was watching them closely. Ceratus had begun concocting a plan of escape. He knew Parabum wasn't going to leave of his own accord. They had already been away too long, and powering up their ship would bring the wrath of the Sanshayum that they were disobeying by staying here. He'd surely be sentenced to death for his actions, and the rest of his pack would be too if they weren't careful. Ceratus's plan was simple. Convince Phaseus, an extremely religious-minded Geralhani, to appeal to Parabum and request that they leave. Doing so would surely incur the wrath of their leader, who would no doubt lash out at his subordinate, thus forcing his younger brother, and the largest among them, Hamadus, to come to his aid. His sibling was massive, and though he was fearful of their chieftain, Ceratus knew he was capable of defeating him. He just needed the right motivation. Ceratus explained that the gods would be disappointed in their inaction. Given their extreme devotion to the great journey, such a prospect terrified them absolutely. Meanwhile, Connor was formulating a plan of his own. His goal was to wait for a confrontation between the 2 brutes who seemed the most disagreeable with each other, and while they were busy going at it, he'd hit them both with tranquilizers. His logic was that by incapacitating the alpha males, the rest of their pack would lose focus and begin fighting amongst themselves. This, theoretically, would give them the ability to make a run for it, eventually arrive at his camp and wait for an evac ship to arrive. Shortly after creating this scheme, the brutes began shouting at one another. Ceratus had finally had enough. When Phaseus suggested they leave, Parabum considered his words for a moment before ultimately denying his request. Confused, Hamadus asked the chieftain if this truly was the will of their gods. Parabum housed no love for the great journey and didn't hesitate to make that known. As he did, Ceratus found that he could no longer hold his tongue, not when faced with such blasphemy. He charged their leader, and as he did, several of the humans began screaming. Connor saw the opportunity and went for it, firing several tranquilizer darts at his captors. One hit the leader as his hammer impacted with the other's face. Both were knocked out cold, and just as he had predicted, all hell broke loose. At breakneck speed, he ran away from the camp, but only Dask followed closely behind. The others either chose to stay in an attempt to get revenge during the skirmish, or were simply too slow to get away. After a hard run, the 2 men finally arrived at Connor's camp. They had somehow survived and escaped the hellish ordeal. All they needed to do now was wait. then make their way to the evac craft when it finally made landfall. The two men relaxed as best they could after experiencing such a horrific string of events. Now that they were back at Connor's camp, they had access to water, something each of the men eagerly made use of. As Connor looked out from the place they had just fled from and contemplated the horrors they had just experienced, Dask approached him from behind. In an instant, a bullet tore through the back of his head and out the other side, splattering bits of brain and bone on the ground below. Dask stood, pistol in hand. He couldn't allow Connor to live and speak of his presence. If everyone knew he was alive, all of his followers would consider him a phony, and the millions that devoted themselves to the Triad would be absolutely heartbroken. He was willing to kill Connor and remain hidden, even if it meant never returning to civilization again, so long as the believers of the Triad could continue to have faith and feel peace. Peace for some was apparently worth murdering an innocent man. A little while later, Connor's compatriots arrived to meet him, but Dask would not make himself known. He could hear as they made their way to the brute camp and systematically eliminated them. Once he was sure everyone had left, he returned to find the brutes had all been killed. In some kind of sad attempt at revenge, he began kicking the corpses of the creatures repeatedly. With each kick, he screamed and cried more, until finally collapsing onto the ground in a bawling heap. Some transcendence. If you're new around here, I usually try to end these kinds of videos with something enlightening or inspiring, but frankly, it's pretty tough to put a positive spin on a story this bleak. Though horror gives us the ability to explore terrifying concepts like flesh-eating beasts or corrupt religious leaders, unfortunately, these are both very real things in our world. In this context, these downright awful concepts are made for fun, and to me, that's part of the beauty of horror. We can have a good time with and make light of some of the most grisly scenarios, or perhaps even arm ourselves with the knowledge to survive them in real life. What the exact lesson we can take from this story in particular, well, it's hard to say. So, I'll leave you with this. Be safe this Halloween, and in general. Make sure you keep a buddy close while you're out there. Allies are the most powerful thing in this world. Alright, that's all I've got. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go play some Halo.